CBS News, Santa Barbara.
A number of diplomatic moves are likely to come up for consideration when Mr. Reagan returns to Washington. One option would be calling off next week's meeting between Secretary Shultz and Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. That possibility is not considered likely at this point. Another option would be to deny U.S. landing rights to the Soviet airline Aeroflot. And the recent U.S. decision to lift controls on sales of pipeline technology may now be reconsidered. But for many people in Washington, it was too soon to talk about reprisal. It was a time for shock and anger, a time for reaction to an action that some found too grotesque for words.
I cannot imagine an adequate answer. And so I am left with a vision of ruthless brutality and contempt for the opinion of mankind.
I think the shooting down of an unarmed civilian plane is an outrageous, despicable, cowardly, murderous act.
We should speak and act in no uncertain terms to show our indignation over this act.
The Pentagon has already responded to events in the Far East. David Martin has more on this and to look at the other side of the coin, Soviet intrusions into American airspace.
The Air Force has sent an AWACS radar plane and 5 F-15 fighter escorts from their base on Okinawa to northern Japan. The planes are there to help in any search for the remnants of Flight 7 and its 269 passengers. But Pentagon officials hold out slim hope of retrieving anything, since most of the wreckage is inside Soviet territorial waters. Additional military moves, such as sending an aircraft carrier, do not seem likely, since there is little a show of force could accomplish now. Instead, the Reagan administration seems bent on making as strong a case as possible condemning the Soviet attack. Not since the Cuban Missile Crisis has any administration deliberately disclosed so much highly classified intelligence. In this case, the contents of intercepted Soviet radio communications.
At 18:26 hours, the Soviet pilot reported that he fired a missile and the target was destroyed.
For one intelligence expert who used to be in charge of intercepting Soviet communications, the gamble was worthwhile.
Protection of sensitive intelligence methods is a very important thing, so that we not lose them. It's very important to our security. But there come times when the national interest requires a choice between some degree of disclosure and the national interest.
Among other things, Shultz's revelations showed just how closely the two superpowers watch each other. The United States guards its airspace just as jealously as the Soviet Union, but not as viciously. Soviet Bear bombers occasionally test U.S. air defenses by flying unannounced into the American air defense zone. Each time, the U.S. scrambles fighter aircraft to intercept the Soviet bombers, but only to escort them out. When it comes to Soviet airliners that stray from their flight paths, the U.S. usually does no more than file a mild protest with Moscow. U.S. officials say those stray Aeroflot flights are no accident. They cite one incident not too long ago when a Soviet jetliner managed to wander off course and overfly a Connecticut shipyard on the very day a new nuclear submarine was being launched. This is David Martin.
We'll have more on Flight 7 in just a few minutes. Turning now to other top stories, 2,000 more Marines head for Lebanon today. The new troops will remain offshore aboard a heavily armed amphibious assault ship.
From ABC News, this is World News This Morning for Friday, September 2nd, 1983. It's 6 a.m. Now from our Washington News Desk, Steve Bell and Kathleen Sullivan.
Good morning, everyone. In the top of the news this morning, Soviet and Japanese ships are continuing their search for the wreckage of that South Korean jetliner shot down by a Soviet fighter.
Also this morning, Senator Henry Jackson of Washington has died of a heart attack.
Now the latest on the Korean plane tragedy. The Soviet Union still refuses to acknowledge that one of its fighter interceptors shot down a Korean airliner with 269 people on board. The Soviets insist their ships and planes are doing all they can to look for wreckage. At the same time, however, they have kept Japanese rescue ships from entering the believed crash area. We get the latest on the search from Bill Rediker.
More than 300 members of Japan's self-defense forces conducted a search operation in the northern Japan Sea. Officials at this radar station in Hokkaido knew where to look since they had monitored the Russian conversations between the Soviet-attacked aircraft and their control staff. However, 4 Japanese patrol ships were ordered by Soviet authorities to stay away from the suspected crash site because these waters are restricted and have been claimed by the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, an oil slick 42 miles off of one of the Soviet islands was identified by Japanese fishermen. And this trawler captain says he heard a couple of loud explosions and saw a bright flash in the sky at the time of the incident. Earlier today, Soviet Ambassador Vladimir Pavlov, in a meeting with the Japanese Foreign Ministry, confirmed the sighting of aircraft wreckage, but denied that his country intentionally shot down the Korean Airlines 747. Japanese relatives of the victims were brought to Korean Airlines headquarters here today. In all, 27 Japanese passengers were on the flight, along with about 30 Americans, including Congressman Larry McDonald from Georgia. At the Soviet embassy here, security was tripled as Japanese-Soviet relations, always marginal at best, plunged to an all-time low. The Prime Minister's office called the incident an extremely regrettable and unforgivable action. Bill Redeker, ABC News, Tokyo.
The Korean jet was shot down about 4 hours from the end of a long journey that began in New York City. Vera Seraphin now looks at what happened on the plane's final flight.
Korean Airlines Flight 7, a jumbo jet like this one, left New York Tuesday night just before midnight en route to Seoul, South Korea. 10 hours later, after a refueling stop, the plane left Anchorage, Alaska, still bound for Seoul. But then, according to both U.S. and Soviet accounts, the airliner strayed off course, 100 miles north of its planned route, traveling over the Kamchatka Peninsula and Sakhalin Island, entering Soviet airspace twice. 2 hours out of Anchorage at noon Eastern Time on Wednesday, the Russians began tracking the plane, which was now on a course that took it over a Soviet submarine base, a course headed for the Soviet city of Vladivostok. According to U.S. accounts, the pilot of a Soviet jet fighter made visual contact with the jumbo jet at 2:12 Eastern Time. And 14 minutes later, that pilot fired a missile, knocking the Korean plane out of the sky.
We know that at least 8 Soviet fighters reacted at one time or another to the airliner. The pilot who shot the aircraft down reported after the attack that he had in fact fired a missile, that he had destroyed the target, and that he was breaking away.
The Soviets have not acknowledged shooting down the Korean plane. American and Russian accounts of what happened do agree that Soviet pilots tried to warn the jetliner, and they agree that a search has turned up no survivors. Barry Seraphin, ABC News, Washington.
The families of many of the Americans aboard that Korean jet were shocked by the news.
What do we do? All your politicians are going to be banging their heads against the wall, and they're going to be issuing wonderful statements for the next month or so, and the incident will be just completely passed off.
How many lives had, had to be taken away before the country do something about it?
War? No, I don't believe in more deaths. I lost a brother in the Second World War. I know what the horrors are. We don't need that. That's not going to bring them back.
Korean Airlines says it plans no changes in the route that the planes fly from the United States to South Korea.